morning, my phone rings, I'm fumbling for the phone. I answer, they're like, is this Rabbi David Rotenberg? Well, it's Live 88.5 calling. We hear that you're a rabbi who wants to be hooked up with a Christmas present. Much to my shame.
That's what it sounded like when Rabbi David Rotenberg was well into his set at the Yuk Yuk's Club in Ottawa a few weeks ago as part of the Jews and Jokes headliner series. On this night, his routine ranged from why he entered that radio station's Christmas contest to win an iPad to the more pointed opening part of his set, where he worried he might trigger the United Nations to appoint a special rapporteur and investigate him for war crimes. For the Orthodox Ottawa rabbi, his life has been a balance. By day, he's been a Hebrew school principal, a teacher, and most recently, he works for the Orthodox youth movement NCSY, where he's managing director of Jewish student clubs at public schools in small and mid-sized communities, from Ottawa to Vancouver. But stand-up comedy has been his passion too, since he was a teen, and he's been writing jokes and performing for audiences large and small, be it fundraisers for Jewish groups, or occasionally being booked for gigs at Yuk Yuk's. For a few years, until recently, the rabbi took a break from the bright lights and focused on his family and his day job, which is helping Jewish students fight back against antisemitism and to find the joy and beauty of being Jewish. But fate and faith steered Rotenberg back to comedy with a renewed energy after October 7th, and he's leaned into his Jewish identity fully during his shows. He still worries he could be heckled, or worse, when he does his material and pro-Israel stuff for mixed crowds. He also has to be careful with Jewish audiences. For instance, his Seinfeld references wouldn't fly when he entertains ultra-Orthodox groups who aren't exposed to pop culture, but who crack up when he tells his Uncle Moishy jokes. And as for subjects which are more politically charged, like antisemitism, the Holocaust, and October 7th, Rabbi Dave, as he's known professionally, thinks it's exactly the right time for Jewish comedy.
If we can find the right tone to address what's going on in our lives and find the humor, yes, we can do two things at once. We can combat anti-Semitism. We can lean in on living as proud Jews.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Rabbi Dave has been preparing for his next high-profile stand-up comedy show, which is this coming Sunday, November 2nd, at Ottawa's Yuk Yuk's. It's billed with the title Funny Jews and features a headliner from New York and a second comedian from Montreal. It's no wonder Rotenberg has to keep his day job for now because, as he tells me, unless you're wildly successful, such as Canadian comedy stars Seth Rogen and Nathan Fielder, Eugene and Dan Levy, and New York's Modi Rosenfeld, small-time stand-up comics like him earn peanuts. Luckily, though, being Jewish during our current times provides him with an unending free supply of material to write about, both laughter and tears. Rabbi Dave joins me now from Ottawa to explain why he left comedy for a while and how October 7th brought him back. Welcome to the CJN's North Star podcast.
Thanks so much.
I know you already because we interviewed you earlier in the post-October 7th time with your real day job hat on when your students at some of the high schools in Ottawa were having serious problems with anti-Semitism, anti-Israel rhetoric, and protests and Gaza walkouts. We'll talk about that afterwards, but our listeners may remember and can go back and listen to how your students handled themselves during that time. It's a year ago now, actually, almost, coming up to November, Remembrance Day, right, when they played the Arabic anthem on the PA system. When you reached out to me and said, hey, I've got a gig coming up at Yuk Yuk's, maybe it'll be a good time for us to chat about my other job, my other life. And so I'm thrilled to bring you on. We all need a little bit of comedy to help us get through these horrible last 2 years and the next stage. In comedy, do you get paid in order to be there as well as having to rent the place? Or is this like an actual paid gig where you don't have to make up the, you know?
In Canadian comedy, even the touring headliners, they make a living. They're not, rolling in the big bucks, but it takes a long time, and it takes a really, really, a lot of work to cross that line into getting hired for weekend shows and getting paid to appear. So for somebody like myself, it's more about the validation than the money when they say, yeah, we want to book you for a Saturday night, because typically if I've made money from a club, it is $25, $50 to appear.
What? That's it? No wonder you have a good day job. You have to eat.
Yeah, when I was the opening act on that special show recently, I got $75 as the opener.
I had no idea this is how it is. Wow. You said you've been doing it for nearly 30 years. When did you become a rabbi and when did you start comedy? What's the time difference?
I mean, when I was in yeshiva high school here in Ottawa back in the mid-90s, we used to love to go down to Yuk Yuk's, just to see the shows. And my friends and I all had a lot of personality, and I would always entertain the guys. And when I was about 15, I wrote some comedy materials, just like, yeah, this is like stand-up style stuff. And so I decided, just shy of 16, that I wanted to try it out. Had to go and watch an amateur show. And then in those days, you had to call in from a payphone on Tuesday mornings to book yourself for Wednesday night for the new talent night. And I remember I actually left a Talmud test early. I finished early to run, this was 1998, I think, run to the 7-Eleven down the street to use the payphone and book myself.
Why, you didn't have a phone at home? You had to do it from a payphone?
I was at school.
Oh, right.
And so, yeah, I started at almost 16 years old, and I was in a, Jewish high school, but certainly not ready to be a rabbi yet. And then fast forward, I actually finished my studies and started working as a rabbi pretty young. I was about 22. I've been a rabbi now for just over 20 years and been a comedian for 27.
There are famous people in Canada who are Jewish who made it big. Before that, there was David Steinberg from Winnipeg in a different generation. Did you have Canadian influences on sort of who you followed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was always a bit of a goofy kind of guy, always telling jokes, always, coming up with different sort of shtick. I think in terms of a Canadian influence, I always loved Norm Macdonald, who also got his start in Yuk Yuk's in Ottawa. But I, over the years, have come to really appreciate a lot of comics who are either local or other Canadians who a lot of people just don't know because they've never made it huge.
Rabbis who start their sermons that I've experienced, almost all of them that I know, start off with a funny joke or a story. So it kind of is useful on both sides of your life.
Yeah. I've always loved to teach Torah using comedy, using pop culture. The final project for my master's was all on Torah insights inspired by comedy and being sort of this unusual rabbi comedian who's able to meld the two.
I mean, the Torah is full of, angry prophets who are predicting doom and lots of smiting and smoting and things like that. It's not funny. There's a lot of funny things in there. There's a lot of heroic things, but there's also a lot of, scary stuff. And I'm wondering if you get pushback in some circles.
I mean, the Torah, you're right. There is heavy stuff, but there's inspiration also. I mean, the question of genre always comes up. Like, if you had to put a genre on the Torah, what would it be? Because it's so varied. And the answer really is that it's a guidebook. The laws are there for guidance. The heavy stuff is there for guidance. The inspiration is there for guidance. And so I think you're right that if you're able to find a way to make it relatable for people. Years ago, I spoke in a very, very black hat congregation. It was over Pesach. I was visiting. They said, "Oh, do you have something you'd like to say?" I was like, "I have a great speech I could give, but it relies on Seinfeld." could I quote it? And they're like hemming and hawing. And they said, you know what, maybe just don't mention the name of the show, but you can say it was a thing from TV. And one of the rabbis who was like just a member of that congregation came over afterwards. He said, that was amazing. So I think that for sure you're going to find people who that is not their style. But for most people, they're going to see that if you are using something to make it more relatable to the average person, there's a lot of beauty there. There's a lot of value there. I have worked primarily in my career with unaffiliated university students, teenagers, etc., or maybe affiliated, but traditional, not super religious people, and trying to make the beauty of Judaism accessible and real to them. And the more we can do that using a medium that they are familiar with and they're going to enjoy, that's going to open the door to, them finding a lot more meaning.
You were mentioning, because you said black hats, so our audience who may not be Jewish or doesn't know, very religious, Haredi Jewish people.
Yeah.
So, who are usually your audiences when you're doing comedy?
I like to think that I can appeal to almost anyone, because although I do all Jewish shows and we're doing this all Jewish show at Yuk Yuk's, I'm going to also just perform as myself on any night of the week at a regular comedy club. And although my material is very rooted in who I am, these are situations that only I would find myself in as a rabbi. And yet, while it has a Jewish flavor, it is not so Jewish that you couldn't understand it if you aren't Jewish yourself. But then when it's an all Jewish crowd, then there's more Jewish stuff that I'm going to lean in on. And then I have also done shows for very religious crowds, and there's stuff that I can do for them that I can't do for anyone else.
Like, for example?
Well, I used to MC a fundraiser every year for the Orthodox school here in Ottawa.
The name?
At the time, it was Torah Academy. They later merged with a different school and became Torah Day School. But in those days, it was Torah Academy. I wrote a whole bit about the famous Jewish singer Uncle Moshe and how he has all these tapes for kids about doing all of the different mitzvos. And like in the first few tapes, it's all of the things like giving charity and learning Torah and saying a bracha. And then like by the 6th and 7th tapes, it's the most obscure commandments you can find because those are the only ones left. That material is not going to fly at Yuk Yuk's and is not even going to go for a mainstream Jewish audience.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I heard one of your Yuk Yuk's tapes, which you kindly sent to me, and there was a bit about Hitler and the Holocaust. But, I was listening to it going, it's funny, but then I don't think this would fly in a lot of audiences because it was really edgy.
When I started out as a teenager, I used to put on a baseball cap and like tuck in my tzitzis and just go and try to be like a regular comedian. And after taking a few years off and I came back to it, I started that way. And then a couple months in, I got an email from Yuk Yuk saying, half the club is booked out by a Jewish group coming in. We want you to come be on the show, do some Jewish material. So I was like, okay, they want me to come and perform as the rabbi. When that has really developed into my thing. And so since then, I've always prided myself on being edgy for a rabbi, but clean for a comedian. I don't swear. I don't touch on topics that would be inappropriate or uncomfortable in the regular sort of comedy ways.
Like sex and drugs, things like that.
Yeah. It's very much in this sort of sarcastic style. These are things that happen to me, and then taking that to sort of its ludicrous extent. So, I don't mind not ruining, but like a little bit of a spoiler. So my probably signature bit that has grown over the years is called Hitler on the Roof. It is based on a true story. I was teaching in a Jewish community day school, and somebody said something about Hitler, and this one girl was so excited to say, I have that movie at home. And when I asked her, what movie does she mean? She said, Hitler on the Roof. I wanted to laugh hysterically. I had wanted to write some Jewish stuff, and I literally went home that day. I said, I have to write a bit called Hitler on the Roof. And I wrote the first couple of punchlines. I did it later that week. It was a huge hit. And over the years, I've had some very funny experiences when I've told that joke, things that people have said, positive feedback, negative feedback, that I've been now incorporated into the bit. I will only go so far with that joke for certain audiences, meaning there are more tame punchlines and more edgy punchlines. And, I think that I managed to toe that line and figure out which audience can handle what.
Look, let's talk about the current biggest Holocaust since the Holocaust, which is, of course, October 7th, that we're still living through. I don't know if it's still too early to make jokes about it or irony or discuss it. How much do you go into that in your material? Where does that sit for you as a comedian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, again, a fine line. I don't have any material about, the conflict itself, but anti-Semitism and what's going on in Canada is certainly top of mind for all Jews. It's certainly something that people can understand even in a general comedy audience. And so to find the humor in the fact that there is anti-Semitism, that's sort of that's always been our deal. We cope through humor. I was out of comedy for a little while. I came back. It was in the middle of the conflict. And so I wrote a bit about how I was out of practice and I came to the club, but I didn't want to do too badly, because the last thing I want is, people are coming out of the club saying, wow, that Jewish comic totally bombed. And then the next thing I know, the UN has appointed some sort of special rapporteur to investigate for war crimes. There's a house on my street that since the start of the conflict, they've had, an anti-Israel protest sign on their lawn. And we spoke to bylaw, isn't there a time limit? There's nothing that we can do about it, but, it's a little bit upsetting. But it turns out that they also have one of those little free libraries. So I went and I dropped off all my old unwanted PJ library books.
Good for you. For our listeners, those are free Jewish books that are sent all around the world to help young families with, Jewish-themed kids' books.
And that's a true story, but I also talk about it in comedy. So I think that it's, if it's happening in my life, or if it's real content in real life, I think there is a way to find the humor in it. And although I certainly have heard the sentiment, maybe these days it's not the time for comedy, but we can also find the the humor to just laugh at whatever we can find.
There's no lack of material, believe me.
And these things together is just like, you know what? Okay, I don't have the time to do it 100%, but I'm going to do it a little bit.
It's amazing. I have to ask you though, you came back into the game when Jewish artists or Israeli artists or Zionist artists are being canceled. How has that impacted you?
I certainly haven't heard anything anti-Semitic or anything anti-Israel from anyone in the comedy scene. I have worked on what are the heckles that you could expect to hear and how do you respond to that? And I even wrote a bit about that. How does a Jewish comic deal with people shouting out, anti-Semitic sorts of things? And so I haven't encountered those issues, but it certainly has been something I've given some thought to just in case. I'm sure that if I was bigger and I was out there more, there would probably be some kinds of venues or some kinds of bookers who wouldn't want a Jewish comic, and certainly someone who is, leaning in on the pro-Israel side. Not that I don't talk politics, but leaning in on how really Jews are hard done by the situation.
I just want to end by going back to what we talked about at the beginning, and that is you're very involved with the students who are frontline, I guess, exposed to what's going on in our public schools. Have you considered, or do you, giving them tools with comedy in order to diffuse and also build bridges?
People say, because through NTSY, we run what we call the Jewish Student Union. Here in Ottawa, we have Jewish clubs in about 18 schools across the area. And people say to me, oh, yeah, you guys are on the front lines combating anti-Semitism. And I say, yes, that's true. But what is even more important is not pushing back against anti-Semitism. It's what we're calling pro-Semitism. Because for the teens, if all you're doing is trying to help them combat the hate and trying to convince them that despite the fact that people hate us, it's okay to be Jewish, the best you can hope for is getting them back to neutral. Whereas if you show them, and this is where personality and fun and trips and Shabbat dinners and all the things that we do, that's where that comes into play. If you can show them that there's actually something meaningful, enjoyable, if there's something positive, so now you're, not just getting back to neutral, you're going in the opposite direction. That doesn't mean ignoring the hate and the anti-Semitism. Of course, we want to give them those tools, but it's more important that they don't just have tools to push back, but also to know why it's important so that they don't just check out.
As a Jewish person, I get a lot of entertainment out of some of the ignorance that non-Jews sometimes show about our Jewish holidays and customs. For example, some of you may have experienced this. In the winter, we have a very popular holiday called Hanukkah. Yeah? Okay, good. Some of you know. It's called Hanukkah. A lot of people seem to think it's like the Jewish version of Christmas, to celebrate the birth of the Jewish Jesus. But several months ago, winter holiday season, I'm in a store. Before I leave, the saleswoman turns to me. She's like, what is it I say to you now? Happy Heineken? Is that what you celebrate, Heineken? It's like, isn't that a kind of beer?
So you mentioned that joke about Heineken. It's, we're coming up to Hanukkah in a month or so. And, I think that is so funny and relevant. Everyone has a story about that they can relate to, people just not getting it, despite all the Hallmark TV shows that they now have, and that new Netflix show, Nobody Wants This, with the hot rabbi and, his non-Jewish wife. Like, it's, what do you call it when somebody just completely doesn't understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's always sort of going to be a lack of understanding. There's a very vague awareness that, we've got our own winter holiday. And probably most Jews have encountered some kind of misunderstanding about that. We just had Sukkot, and I was searching for sukkah clip art. You wouldn't believe how many of these clip art images have a menorah in the sukkah. But again, this is, a lot of my comedy is based on real experiences. This was several years ago. I was actually getting, I think, the vaccine for H1N1 or something like that. And the woman said to me, what is it I say to you? Happy Heineken?
It wasn't anti-Semitism. It's just pure ignorance.
And people say to me, like, why do so many funny things happen to you? And I think I'm just sensitive to them. Most people would laugh and say, oh, she got the name wrong. I went home and wrote a bit about it and have been telling it for years. So I think that's really the key, is to look for the humor in these situations and then take it to its absurd extent.
Love it. It's been an honor to chat with you.
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Now, you can learn more about Rabbi Dave through the links in our show notes. North Star is produced by Andrea Varsany and Zachary Judah Kaufman. The executive producer of North Star is Michael Freeman, and our theme was composed by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.